today's episode, we examine the climb where a couple married on Everest and their bodies were found after, above 27,000 feet. The husband made a seemingly simple decision that the Sherpas immediately recognized as fatal. What unfolded from that moment is one of the most devastating outcomes the mountain has ever seen. It was May 3rd, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where the afternoon sun softened the glacial moraine into slush that soaked through boot seams. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, mild by Everest standards, with only occasional gusts strong enough to rattle tent fabric. Prayer flags stretched between cairns, snapped lazily in the thin air, their colors faded by seasons of ultraviolet exposure and wind. The camp sprawled across uneven terrain in clusters organized by expedition company, each group isolated by invisible boundaries of logistics and liability. Somewhere in the maze of orange and yellow domes, between the cooking tents and the medical station, Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves sat outside their tent, reviewing route maps for the third time that day. Connor was 32 years old, a software engineer from Seattle who had discovered climbing during a corporate team-building exercise 8 years earlier. What began as an awkward afternoon on an indoor wall had evolved into an obsession that redefined his identity. He quit his stable position at a tech firm after 3 years, took contract work that allowed flexibility, and spent every available dollar and vacation day pursuing vertical terrain. By his late 20s, he had climbed Rainier more than a dozen times, established new routes in the Cascades, and completed winter ascents in the Alaska Range that earned quiet respect in climbing circles. He approached mountains the way he had once approached code, methodically, with exhaustive preparation and backup plans for contingencies most climbers never considered. Maya was 30 years old, a wilderness EMT from Boulder who had grown up in a family that treated mountains as weekend destinations rather than exotic challenges. Her father had summited Denali twice before she was born, and she completed her first 14er at age 9. By 16, she was leading her own climbs. By 25, she had summited 5 of the 7 summits and worked as a guide on Aconcagua and Kilimanjaro. She possessed the rare combination of technical skill and physiological adaptation that allowed her to function at extreme altitude with less suffering than most climbers endured, where others gasped and stumbled above 20,000 feet. Maya moved with steady efficiency, her body processing thin air with the ease of someone born to high places. They'd met on Denali during a long weather hold at 14,000 feet, and the connection stuck because it wasn't built on small talk. Their relationship formed around decisions made in thin air, and it never really left the mountains. 18 months earlier, Connor proposed on Cho Oyu, and in March 2016, they married in a small ceremony in the Rockies. Everyone who knew them understood the honeymoon would happen somewhere high and dangerous. The decision unsettled both families. Connor's parents saw only risk and cost, unable to understand why anyone would begin a marriage by gambling against a mountain known for killing even experienced climbers. Maya's father understood the danger more intimately. Everest, he warned her, was less a technical challenge for Mich than a logistical gamble where weather, traffic, and timing decided outcomes long before skill could matter. Friends from the climbing community offered more nuanced warnings. Several had attempted Everest and turned back, recognizing that summit fever was the mountain's most reliable killer. One friend, who had turned back at the south summit due to deteriorating weather, told them the mountain rewarded discipline and punished ambition. He described bodies still frozen on the upper slopes, climbers who had pushed beyond turnaround times. The difference between summiting and dying often came down to the willingness to walk away. Both Connor and Maya thanked him for the advice, assured him they would climb conservatively, and privately dismissed the warnings as applicable to less experienced climbers. They chose a mid-tier operator with a respectable safety record. The lead guide, Ian Croft, was a conservative New Zealander with 9 Everest summits who treated turnaround times and oxygen discipline as non-negotiable. Their combined experience exceeded most climbers on the mountain, and Ian recognized it early, treating them as partners rather than liabilities. Connor and Maya agreed to all protocols, though their combined experience exceeded most climbers on the mountain. The trek from Lukla to base camp took 10 days, allowing gradual acclimatization. Both performed well, arriving on April 18th with strong appetites and none of the persistent headaches or nausea that plagued less adapted climbers. The expedition doctor found their oxygen saturation levels within expected ranges. They were physiologically suited to extreme altitude. Acclimatization rotations began in late April, climbing high, sleeping low, allowing the body to adapt. The first rotation took them through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, where they spent one night before descending. Both moved confidently through the chaotic terrain, navigating ladder crossings and crevasse systems with ease. The second rotation reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet in the western CWM, a glacial valley enclosed by Everest's southwest face and the steep walls of Nuptse. The sun's radiation, reflected by surrounding ice, turned the CWM into a furnace during daylight hours, with temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Climbers shed layers and consume water at rates that seemed impossible at altitude. Connor and Maya reached Camp 2 after 6 hours of steady climbing, faster than most clients but slow enough to conserve energy. They spent 2 nights acclimatizing, eating freeze-dried meals and forcing down calories their suppressed appetites did not want. On the third rotation, they climbed the Lhotse face to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, ascending steep blue ice on fixed ropes while their crampon points scraped against hard frozen surfaces. The climbing demanded sustained effort, each step calculated and deliberate, with rest stops every 100 feet to allow burning muscles and laboring lungs to recover. Maya moved slightly faster than Connor on steep ice, her years of guiding providing an efficiency advantage that showed most clearly on technical terrain. Connor followed steadily, his methodical pace reflecting the conservative approach he applied to everything. They reached Camp 3 after 7 hours and spent a single night before descending to base camp for final rest. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had climbed an 8,000-meter peak. Push high, retreat low, allow the body to adapt, repeat. The process took weeks, wearing down physical reserves as bodies cannibalized muscle and fat to sustain basic functions in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. Connor and Maya weathered the rotations better than most clients. Their weight loss was moderate, their appetites remained functional, and their sleep, though poor by sea level standards, was adequate for high-altitude recovery. Ian Croft monitored their progress and concluded they were among the strongest clients in the expedition. He mentioned privately to the Sherpa team that the couple would likely summit if the weather cooperated, and they maintained discipline during the final push. The summit window opened on May 16th, 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies, the best opportunity of the season. Teams began moving upward from base camp, staging at higher camps for summit attempts that would begin from Camp 4 on the South Col. Connor and Maya departed base camp on May 17th, climbing through the Khumbu Icefall in pre-dawn darkness before the sun destabilized Cerex and increased rockfall danger. They moved efficiently, their bodies now accustomed to the altitude, and reached Camp 2 by early afternoon. After a night's rest, they continued to Camp 3, arriving on May 18th with enough daylight remaining to melt snow for water and prepare equipment for the following day's push to Camp 4. The climb from Camp 3 to the South Col required ascending the upper Lhotse face and traversing the exposed terrain of the Yellow Band and Geneva Spur. The route was less technically difficult than the climbing below, but far more dangerous due to the altitude. At 26,000 feet, they entered the death zone, where oxygen levels dropped below the threshold necessary to sustain human life for extended periods. Every hour spent above this altitude caused cellular damage that recovery could not fully reverse. Speed was not optional, it was survival. They reached Camp 4 at 1:30 p.m. on May 19th, giving them time to rest before the summit push that would begin near midnight. The South Col was a windswept plateau littered with the debris of decades of expeditions, abandoned oxygen bottles, torn tents, frozen human waste, and the occasional body too difficult to recover. The wind was moderate, around 20 miles per hour, cold but manageable. Connor and Maya forced down energy gels and soup, knowing their bodies needed fuel even as their suppressed appetites rejected food. They tried to sleep, but managed only fitful rest, their minds aware of what lay ahead. At 11:45 p.m., their Sherpa team woke them and helped prepare for departure. Mingma Dorje, a 38-year-old Sherpa with 7 Everest summits, would accompany them along with his partner Pazang Gyaltsen, who had summited 5 times. Both Sherpas were experienced and competent, and Ian Croft had assigned them to Connor and Maya precisely because the couple required minimal supervision. The plan was straightforward: maintain a steady pace, monitor oxygen consumption, reach the summit by midday, and descend immediately without extended celebration. They departed Camp 4 at 12:30 a.m. on May 20th, joining a line of headlamps that stretched up the triangular face toward the balcony. The climbing was steep but manageable on fixed ropes, with hard snow and occasional rock requiring careful crampon placement. The cold was severe, -25 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill pushing it lower, but their layering systems held. Connor moved slightly slower than Maya, his pace deliberate and controlled, while she climbed with the efficiency of someone whose body had found rhythm in thin air. The balcony arrived at 4:10 a.m., a small platform at 27,600 feet, where they rested briefly and changed oxygen bottles. Mingma checked their conditions and found both strong and alert. They were climbing faster than anticipated, putting them on track for an early summit, if the pace held. The decision was made to continue without extended rest. Above the balcony, the route traversed steep slopes and narrow ridges where fixed ropes provided security, but concentration could not lapse. A single misstep would send a climber tumbling thousands of feet down faces too steep to arrest. The darkness concealed the exposure, which was both mercy and danger. Easier to focus on the immediate task, harder to judge terrain features that daylight would reveal. The south summit appeared at 7:50 a.m., a false peak at 28,700 feet that marked the beginning of the most dangerous section, the traverse across the Cornice Ridge to the Hillary Step and final summit pyramid. Connor and Maya paused to rest while other climbers queued at narrow sections ahead. The sun had risen, illuminating the Himalayan panorama in sharp light that made the air seem thinner and the distances impossibly vast. They were less than 300 feet below the summit. During a routine check at the south summit, Mingma noticed Maya's gauge, sitting lower than expected. He examined the regulator and found no malfunction. The higher consumption likely reflected a slightly elevated flow setting, combined with the repeated stop and start pace forced by traffic above. He swapped her partially depleted bottle for a full one, making a note that they would need to monitor consumption carefully on descent. Quick reminder, if stories like this hold your attention, consider subscribing. These mountains carry more history than most people realize. Now let's get back to the mountain. They reached the Hillary Step at 9:15 a.m., finding a queue of climbers waiting to ascend the near vertical rock and ice pitch that represented the final technical obstacle before the summit. Recent seasons had altered the rock and ice there, subtly reshaping the move but not eliminating the bottleneck. Connor and Maya waited patiently, conserving energy and staying warm while climbers ahead moved slowly up the exposed face. By 10:30 a.m., they had cleared the Hillary Step and were climbing the final summit ridge, a narrow spine of snow with exposure on both sides, falling away into Tibet and Nepal. The wind had increased to around 30 miles per hour, strong enough to require focused balance, but not dangerous enough to force retreat. Other climbers were visible on the summit ahead, tiny figures against blue sky. Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves reached the summit of Mount Everest at 11:04 a.m. on May 20th, 2016. They stood at 29,029 feet, the highest point on Earth, surrounded by a 360-degree panorama of peaks that stretched to every horizon. The sky was clear, the wind moderate, and the conditions as perfect as Everest ever offered. They embraced carefully, mindful of their oxygen masks and the narrow summit space, and allowed themselves a moment of triumph that justified years of preparation and the concerns they had dismissed from family and friends. Mingma took photographs with their camera, capturing images of the couple standing together on top of the world. They posed with flags they had carried, an American flag, a Colorado state flag, and a banner their friends had signed at the wedding. The celebration was subdued, appropriate for an altitude where every minute consumed oxygen and depleted reserves. Ian Croft had been clear about the protocol, 15 minutes maximum at the summit, then immediate descent. But 15 minutes extended to 20, then 25. Maya wanted additional photographs from different angles. Connor struggled briefly with a small video camera that had frozen in the cold, requiring time to revive it. Other climbers arrived, creating a crowded summit that required waiting for clear shots. The delays were small individually, each justified by reasonable desires to document the achievement, but they accumulated into time that eroded the margin between safe descent and disaster. They began descending at 11:43 a.m., 39 minutes after reaching the summit. The descent from the Hillary step was slow due to traffic, with climbers still ascending while those who had summited tried to descend on the same fixed ropes. By the time they cleared the bottleneck and reached the south summit at 1:15 p.m., Maya's oxygen had dropped to reserve levels. Mingma checked her supply and discovered she had less than 90 minutes remaining at current flow rates. The South Col was at least 4 hours away. The math was suddenly unforgiving. Maya insisted she felt strong and could manage with reduced oxygen flow. Mingma agreed reluctantly, lowering her regulator to conserve the remaining supply. The decision was reasonable given their position. They were descending, which required less oxygen than climbing, and she was one of the strongest clients he had guided. But the choice removed margin for error. Any delays, any increased exertion, any physiological stress would consume the buffer that kept her alive. Connor's oxygen was in better condition, with roughly 3 hours remaining. Pasang monitored him closely and saw no signs of distress. The plan was to descend together, with Maya on reduced flow until they reached Camp 4, where spare bottles waited. It should have been adequate. It would have been adequate if circumstances had remained stable. At approximately 2:40 p.m., descending below the balcony at around 27,200 feet, Maya stopped suddenly and leaned heavily on her ice axe. Connor, descending ahead of her on the fixed line, did not immediately notice. Mingma, following directly behind Maya, reached her within seconds and found her breathing rapidly despite the oxygen mask. Her movements had become uncoordinated, her legs trembling with the effort of supporting her weight. The symptoms indicated severe hypoxia, her brain and muscles starving for oxygen that her depleted supply could no longer provide. Mingma increased her flow to maximum, knowing it would exhaust the bottle within minutes, but hoping it would revive her enough to continue descending. Maya nodded when asked if she could keep moving, but her eyes had lost focus. Mingma recognized the expression. He had seen it before, on clients whose bodies were shutting down. Connor looked back and realized the line had stopped. Mingma signaled that Maya's oxygen was failing and that they had to get her down to Camp 4 immediately. Connor began climbing back up toward her, his concern overriding the protocol to continue descending efficiently. What happened next unfolded with the terrible logic of compounding errors. Maya's oxygen bottle emptied completely at approximately 2:55 p.m. Mingma removed his own oxygen bottle and fitted it onto Maya's regulator with practiced speed. The exchange left him temporarily without supplemental oxygen, but Sherpas were conditioned for brief exposure at extreme altitude in ways clients were not. Connor reached Maya's position and attempted to help support her, but 3 people, clustered on a narrow section of fixed rope, created congestion that further reduced efficiency. For several minutes, the change appeared to help. Maya's breathing slowed, and she managed a dozen careful steps downward, but the delay had already cost them too much time. Mingma, now climbing without oxygen, began to slow. His movements remained efficient but carried less urgency, his body already making the calculations that hypoxia demanded. Traffic above forced repeated stops. Every pause bled warmth and strength. At 3:05 p.m., Connor had just surrendered the margin that had been keeping him alive. He removed his remaining oxygen bottle and held it toward Pasang, the exchange occurring without discussion. Pasang understood immediately what Connor was offering and what it would mean. The bottle was transferred to Maya, replacing Mingma's supply, which had been burning faster than expected at her elevated flow rate. Maya received Connor's oxygen and immediately showed continued improvement. Her breathing steadied further, her coordination returned, and she began descending again with Mingma's support. But Connor, already exhausted from the summit push, now began the descent on reserves alone. His body had little physiological buffer left once the oxygen was gone. For the first 10 minutes, his pace merely slowed. He moved with deliberate care, his crampon placements precise but requiring longer to execute. Pasang stayed close, watching for the deterioration he knew was coming. At 15 minutes, Connor's speech became slightly slurred when he responded to questions. At 20 minutes, he missed a crampon placement entirely, his foot scraping against the ice before finding purchase on the second attempt. His tunnel vision had already begun, his peripheral awareness collapsing inward as his brain rationed oxygen to essential functions. By 25 minutes, without supplemental oxygen, Connor's responses to Pasang's questions arrived several seconds late, his processing speed degrading in ways that signaled imminent collapse. His legs began to fail at 30 minutes, trembling visibly under his weight, each step a negotiation between will and physiology that Will was losing. At 3:40 p.m., Connor collapsed onto the snow and could not rise. Pasang checked his airway, felt for a pulse through layers of down, and waited longer than he should have before accepting what the mountain had already decided. Connor's eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow and irregular. His brain, deprived of adequate oxygen at extreme altitude, was shutting down. Pasang had no spare oxygen to give him. The only option was to descend immediately and hope a lower altitude would reverse the damage before it became permanent. Moving an unconscious climber on terrain, this steep required manpower that did not exist at that altitude. Even strong Sherpas rarely survive such efforts. The physics were merciless. Connor's weight, the angle of the slope, the distance remaining, and the oxygen demands of anyone attempting the carry made survival impossible for both the rescued and the rescuers. Maya, now breathing adequately on the oxygen Connor had sacrificed, understood what was happening when Mingma's radio traffic reached her position below. She stopped descending and tried to climb back to him, but Mingma stepped into her path and refused to let her pass. Mingma understood that stopping meant losing them both. Her screams carried across the empty slopes, raw sounds that altitude stripped of everything except grief. Connor Walsh lost consciousness completely at approximately 4:15 p.m. at 26,900 feet. Pasang stayed with him as long as the fading light and his own depleting oxygen allowed, covering him with an emergency blanket that the wind immediately began tearing away. By the time Pasang reached Camp 4 at 6:45 p.m., his face was blank, his report delivered in the flat tone of someone who had run this calculation before and knew the outcome never changed. Higher on the mountain, Maya was running out of time. By the time Mingma forced her downward past 26,500 feet, the oxygen Connor had surrendered was already running low again. The descent had taken longer than any of them could afford. Traffic above, failing light, and her own exhaustion had erased whatever margin remained. Her pace deteriorated steadily. What had begun as controlled steps became slow, mechanical movements that required constant prompting. Several times, she stopped without realizing she had stopped at all, her focus narrowing to the few feet of snow in front of her crampons. Mingma increased her flow briefly, but the bottle was nearly spent. At approximately 25,800 feet, Maya sat down without warning and did not respond when urged to stand. Her eyes remained open, but the engagement behind them had thinned to something distant. Severe hypoxia had begun its predictable work, judgment dissolving first, then coordination, then the basic will to move. Mingma tried to lift her, but Maya resisted with the dull, irrational strength common to critically oxygen-deprived climbers. She insisted she only needed a moment. Moments at that altitude were measured in survival, not minutes. Darkness overtook the slope before they could reach the tents. Temperatures fell rapidly, the wind strengthening as the last light disappeared behind the ridge. Without oxygen, without movement, and with her body already failing, Maya's chances narrowed with each passing minute. Sherpas departing Camp 4 at first light found her less than 1,000 vertical feet above the South Col, seated exactly where Mingma had been forced to leave her when his own oxygen approached depletion. Ice had formed along the edges of her mask, and one glove lay half removed, a common sign of advanced hypoxia, where the brain misfires and heat feels unbearable even as the body freezes. Connor Walsh and Maya Reeves were found within sight of the same descent route they had climbed together only hours earlier. The body recovery team determined neither could be safely retrieved from their positions and left them where they fell. Connor's parents later received a flag he had carried to the summit that was never displayed. The mountain had allowed them to stand together at the highest point on Earth, but it did not allow them to leave it. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.